Hi everybody and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name's Alicia and I'm the owner of Alicia Be Creative. This is the part 2 of our 3D gingerbread tumbler tutorial. So if you didn't catch part 1, be sure to stop this video and go back to the part 1. But here is the epoxying process for our tumbler. Let's go ahead and jump right into today's video. So last we left this, I had just finished applying the gingerbread house, the 3D element, to the tumbler with some UV resin. I am now going to fill in some of the cavities that are part of this three-dimensional piece. So in this sort of piece, this 3D piece that I got from Kami Page Boutique, she has set these up so that you can string like some fairy lights through them and make it, you know, a lit up sort of tumbler effect. I decided that I didn't want to go that route as far as adding lights, and since I didn't have a cup that I could sort of hide the battery pack for. So what I did was I went in with some UV resin after I applied the 3D gingerbread house to the cup and filled in any of those holes that were in the windows and in the door frame of this structure. And I've let that cure. Now I'm going to go back with some regular epoxy. I'm using Fast Set, Flynn Sisters Fast Cure, and I added a little bit of willow to this, of course, to give it a little bit of sparkle. But I'm going to take this 20 ml of mixed up epoxy here, and I'm going to take that time now to fill in these additional cavities. So the reason I wanted to do this or needed to do this is because the next step is going to be epoxying this cup and epoxying the structure, and I didn't want there to be any opportunity for epoxy to pool in areas and create any sort of additional bubbles or have, you know, epoxy kind of leaking out all over the place as this spins. So I wanted to make sure that this was sort of as flush as it could be, that any of these sort of deeper cavities were filled with some sort of resin. That way I didn't have a difficult time with the epoxying process and needing to spend more time torching or running into an issue where some of my epoxy starts to run and cause some ripples. So I'm just going through sort of all of these different windows and the little sort of window on top of the door frame here to fill in with that bit of epoxy. It only took me about 20 mLs in total to fill up all of these cavities. Now I do have, again, a bit of UV resin in under this Fast Cure, just to fill up the little holes that the fairy lights are supposed to go in, but it didn't take me too much resin to need to fill up these little cavities. So once I am done applying this, I'm going to set this just like this on the cup turner, keep it flat. I don't want any of that to run. I'm going to let that cure for a few hours before we get into our first layer of epoxy here. So of course the cup already has a couple layers of epoxy, but now we need to get the actual gingerbread house, get that epoxied as well. So I'm going to go in with my Flynn Sisters Artist Cure epoxy, and I'm going to mix up just about 30 mLs. I'm going to be focusing most of this epoxy on the actual gingerbread structure. Since the cup is pretty smooth, I will of course go in and add epoxy to the cup as well, of course, to keep that adherence of the gingerbread house to the cup secure. But I really am going to focus with this first coat of epoxy on mostly the gingerbread house. So once I've mixed my epoxy, which takes about 5 minutes or so to mix, I like to heat up my part A of my Artist Cure epoxy to ensure that I can get this mixed thoroughly. After I've gotten it mixed for that 5 minutes and I don't have any ribbons in my epoxy and it is all thoroughly mixed, I'm going to take just a cheap paintbrush and I'm really going to paint on the epoxy onto the gingerbread structure. Now the reason why I am sort of painting the epoxy on versus using my gloved hands and applying it just like I would to the cup is because there's so many different sort of, you know, grooves and divots in this structure. I don't want to accidentally apply too much epoxy to this and create any weird rippling or dimpling, similar to the concern I had before with needing to sort of fill in those window gaps as well. So I want to make sure that I have a nice thin even layer over my first two coats over this gingerbread house. And so in order to get a nice thin layer, I'm going to take this sheet paintbrush and paint on the epoxy so that I don't over pour or over, apply my epoxy onto the gingerbread structure. So as I move through sort of getting this covered with epoxy, I'm just tilting and turning my cup arm to give me access to those different sides and angles. I have such a thin coat on here that I don't need to worry about the epoxy I've already applied sort of sliding and slipping all over. I've applied a thin enough layer that there's not a whole lot of movement happening. So once I have fully covered the gingerbread house, and again, this is the first initial layer, I'm going to go ahead and just use a little bit of extra epoxy I had in that cup, and I'm going to apply that to the rest of the cup. So once I have applied the little bit of epoxy, because no epoxy goes to waste, I'm going to go ahead and torch this. And this is the first of 2 layers that I'm going to do before we get into the next step. So once this cures, well, typically I like to do another flood coat. So after this has been sitting and spinning for about 6 hours, since this takes about 24 hours to cure this epoxy, I'll go back in with my second coat of epoxy, doing the same exact fashion that I did with this coat here. That way I get a real nice smooth finish over my gingerbread house. Now, this isn't going to be the final coats of epoxy, but this is going to sort of build up those layers on the gingerbread house to allow this to become a smooth structure at the end of the finished results. So finally, I'm going to torch this, and then I'll let that spin for a few hours before I apply my second coat. Now, after my cup has cured for 24 hours and I can touch it without it being tacky or sticky, I'm gonna go ahead and get this drip ready. So I've mixed again equal parts of Artist Cure from Flint Sisters Part A and Part B. I've only mixed about 20 mLs because this is only a 20-ounce cup. I don't need a whole lot of epoxy to create my drip here, but in order to give this that white look, I am going to add the Alumilite white epoxy dye. Just a drop goes a long way, and turn this epoxy white. Now, I have shown in my tutorials lots of different opportunities where I've done drips on cups. Epoxy drips are my favorite, but there is a lot of waiting and patience that you have to do when you're doing an epoxy drip. So I have had to let my epoxy sit for almost about an hour, and I actually probably should have let it sit longer because it is not as thick of a consistency as I like to work with when I am doing a drip for epoxy, but time was not on my side when I was finishing up this drip. I had somewhere to be and needed to leave almost immediately. So I wanted to, of course, get my epoxy on this cup before I left the house. So I am just going to take my stir stick here and sort of swirl that thickened epoxy around my stir stick and then apply that in a thick layer around the top edge of this cup. Now again, as I mentioned, this is not as thick for a drip as I like to use. I like this to be almost as thick as molasses when I go to do this sort of drip. So this was a little bit more runny than I'm used to, and you're going to see me having to do a bit more cleanup than I'm used to having to do with an epoxy drip, but it is still doable. I would recommend leaving your epoxy, and all epoxy is different, but I would leave your epoxy anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour to sit, checking it though every 10 minutes, because dependent on how warm your area is, obviously your epoxy might cure or might begin to thicken up a little bit quicker. My space is a bit cold even with my heaters on, and so it probably would have taken me a good hour and 10 minutes for me to get to the thickness that I prefer. So once I'm satisfied with getting the drip around the cup, I'm going to now begin to add some of this white epoxy to the top of the gingerbread house here. So just kind of adding it just to look like snowdrifts on top of the roof here. And you'll notice I'm flipping my cup sort of upside down and then right side up. And that is to prevent my epoxy from dripping further down than I want it to. So because my epoxy is a bit thinner than I'm used to, my epoxy is moving a bit quicker than I want it to. So I am going to just continue to flip my cup back and forth to kind of slow down the dripping process of my epoxy. I'm now going to take a bit of a paper towel and some 91% rubbing alcohol and just clean up any areas that I wasn't thrilled with because my epoxy dripped too far. So I had a couple strings of epoxy that looked a little wonky in the back, and then I had a little bit that got too far down on sort of the gingerbread house structure that I wanted to clean up as well. I'm then going to go back and just continue to add until I'm satisfied with the amount of epoxy and drip I have going on my cup before I get into now, of course, adding my sprinkles. So these sprinkles I picked up from a vendor that I don't think sells these pastel sprinkles anymore. So I will link something else in the description box. You can find them on Amazon. They're just sort of faux, you know, polymer clay sprinkles. You can get them in various colors. These ones come with little pearls as well as part of this pastel mix. So I normally would just apply them with tweezers as I kind of started, but they started to kind of stick to the tweezers and it was just kind of more of a pain. So I just decided to use my gloved hand and just sprinkle those around. And then you could use your tweezers to just remove any pieces that you don't like the way they've laid down, or to add a couple extra, you know, sprinkles to areas that maybe are a little more sparse. Essentially just adding sprinkles where you wish to for your final look. So once I am done with this drip does need to cure, so I let it cure for a full 24 hours before I put this on the turner for its 2 final coats of epoxy, the same method in which I did at the beginning of the video. And here is the final look at this video. So I know this video was of course shorter than some of my other tutorials, but I really wanted to spend time showing you guys how to epoxy structures like this, especially if you're getting into 3D structures. But I do hope that you did enjoy today's video, and of course if you did, be sure to give this video a huge thumbs up and subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you guys again in the next one. Bye!